I had a less than conventional upbringing, let me tell you. Firstly, have you ever heard of Ruby Franke? So, she was a YouTuber, although not like you, I hope. I'm sure most people know her. She ran that 8 Passengers channel and was eventually sent to prison for some fairly serious child neglect, along with some woman that she was shacked up with. And they claim to be Mormons, but to my knowledge, there's nothing in the teachings of Mormonism and the Latter-day Saints that tells people to be that obscenely cruel to their offspring. Obviously, I'm not one of the 8 Passengers kids, but when that story first came out, I followed it with utter horror. At times, I was shaking on the floor, actually in tears, and even my hubby couldn't console me. Only a cuddle from my beautiful 10-year-old daughter could snap me back to reality. I'm a mom myself, and I cannot imagine in any universe treating my beloved daughter like that. The Ruby Franke story didn't disturb me just because it was horrible, though. It disturbed me because it reminded me deeply of my own childhood. When I finally escaped that hell at 18, I always kind of assumed that I had a unique, one-of-a-kind, abusive upbringing. But seeing the 8 Passengers story made me wonder how many other families like that are out there. Families who, for whatever reason, become their own kind of cults. People don't realize that dangerous cults are far more than just weird hippies wearing robes and killing actresses or moving to Guyana and drinking the Kool-Aid. There are cults of personalities, MLMs, that are kind of cults. And there are social and political movements, some of which start off with the best of intentions even. But cult behavior is always cult behavior. And the more people get wrapped up in their own cults, the more they start to believe their own bullcrap. And this is what I can only imagine happened to my parents. By the time I was born, the parental group of my family consisted of Mother Cora, stepfather Jacko, Auntie Brady, and her partner, Uncle Eric. And then there was Mama Charlene, who wasn't related to us by blood, but was the matriarch of our family unit. Now, I was the oldest of the 4 kids. We were all instructed to call each other siblings. It was Brother John, Sister Sabrina, Brother Roger, and me, Sister Krista. Now, if it sounds weird the way that I've written these names, that's because it was. This is how we had to address each other from as young as I could remember. If we slipped up and missed the prefix, we would be punished. For example, one day I was playing with Sister Sabrina, and I called her Sabrina. Auntie Brady overheard this, dragged me from the room, and smacked my palms with one of those beach sticks that the adults always keep on hand for regular punishments. And there were so many rules like this. And as a little kid who grew up with them, I didn't really question them. According to Mama Charlene, who we were to regard as an almost holy figure, these things were the decrees of our Lord. If we did anything that went against the decrees of the Lord, we would be punished. I do not remember what all the decrees were, but only because years of therapy and distance has allowed me to tune them out. Every day, we would begin our morning by reading through the 4 pages of decrees that we had to follow. We were not allowed to leave our rooms until we'd finished reading them, not even to use the bathroom. Of course, when some of us were really little, this led to accidents, and that broke one of the decrees. And here are the ones that I can remember. Don't dirty yourself. Address the family appropriately. Thank the Lord upon waking, even if just from a nap. Thank the Lord before and after meals. Do not take the Lord's name in vain. And then there was some of the more bizarre ones. We weren't allowed to eat any food that was orange, because orange was a sign that it came from the devil. One time, Brother Roger asked why this was, and Mama Charlene caned him for questioning the word of the Lord, and then explained that the devil's flesh is orange. Brother Roger said that he thought the devil was red. And Mama Charlene explained that when you cut a red devil, they're orange on the inside. And so from then on, we unflinchingly understood that carrots, oranges, butternut squash, and similar stuff were just evil. Never orange candy, though. We weren't allowed candy as Tooth decay came from the devil too. And fire was evil too, because that was orange, so we weren't allowed to just look at fire. The adults cooked, and us kids had to do things like peel the vegetables, butter the bread, and tend the vegetable garden. And we had the last task, because the shed was in the garden. The shed was where we'd get sent if we misbehaved too badly. The longest I ever spent in the shed was 3 days. Brother John was once sent for over 2 weeks. If we were locked in the shed, you were able to use the toilet in the bucket, which one of the other kids would just empty every 2 days. You were brought 1 pitcher of water a day and 3 slices of dry bread. When one of us had to enter the shed to bring food to our sibling or empty that bucket, the punished child had to stand in the corner facing the wall. If they turned and looked at us, we were to report them to Stepfather Jacko specifically. We were all far too afraid of Stepfather Jacko not to tell on our siblings. The strangest part about this is that I never once remember Stepfather Jacko actually punishing us. We were just for some reason incredibly afraid of him. It was just drummed into us from a very early age that we were not to feel love for our siblings. Even though we weren't all related by blood, we were all siblings in the eyes of the Lord. And thus feeling any love for each other was unnatural and unholy. The same went for the adults. They would remind us every day that they did not love us, and we should not love them in turn. The only person that we could love was the Lord. The one exception was on Mama Charlene's birthday. One day we had to bow in front of her and tell her that for this one day only, our love was hers. And the reason for this was never really explained to us. Our house had various bookshelves, but we were never allowed to read them. All the spines had been covered up except for the Bibles. However, despite claims that we served and loved the Lord, we were never taught anything directly from the Bible. We knew nothing of Jesus. And in fact, I never even heard the name of the Son of God until I escaped that family. And we were taught to read, but we were taught from books that had been written by Mama Charlene in her very spidery handwriting. They were all books about the family, about Mother Cora, Stepfather Jacko, Auntie Brady, and Uncle Eric. Mama Charlene herself was never in the books. They were mostly tales of our family's adventures before the Lord burdened them with us children. The books referred to us as the albatrosses, a reference that I didn't get until many years later. Read the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner if it's not familiar. In the books, Mother Caw, Stepfather Jacko, Auntie Brady, and Uncle Eric had fun and wild adventures. They went exploring mountains. They visited these fairs, and they went fishing on lakes. They even solved mysteries. They had a pet and something that the books called a waffle lump. I'm not even joking. And I later found out that all but one of the books were just abridged versions of the famous 5 books rewritten by Mama Charlene to just peddle her insanity. And the book that used to scare me the most was the first book. Stepfather Jacko wasn't in that book. And instead, there was a man called Daddy Cobton. Now, Daddy Cobbleton was a wicked man who tried to lead the others astray. He guided them into hell itself, where he peeled his skin to reveal the orange demon beneath. And there he did unspeakable things to Mother Caw, until Auntie Brady and Uncle Eric cast him into a fiery pit. At the end of the book, Mother Caw gave birth to me, Sister Krista, and the Lord sends Stepfather Jacko to the family. But then, Daddy Cobbleton returned 3 more times, impregnating Mother Caw again, and Auntie Brady twice. And each time they saw him off with weapons, and then Mama Charlene was sent by the Lord to protect us. And that's what the book said. And as I grew older and began to observe the reality of how the world worked, I started to realize that orange demons didn't exist. My siblings weren't hellspawn. The world that we lived in was very, very abnormal. Our house was very remote in the middle of nowhere, but occasionally we'd be visited by traveling salesmen, or families in cars would just drive past, and they just simply did not live like us. They wore fancy, wonderful clothes, not the basic sheets that we wore. The children had hair, not the shaved heads like we had, and none of us were allowed bedrooms. Up until I turned 18, the 4 siblings slept on mattresses and 4 corners of a room. Lines were drawn dividing the room into 4. If one of us entered into another sibling's quadrant after 8 p.m., we would be punished. And the punishment usually involved having our hands whipped or spending time in the shed. But there were other things too. Standing outside and having ice water tipped over us, having to stand there while the other siblings yelled the meanest things they could think of at us. If a sibling wasn't mean enough, they would get punished instead. Now one day, Brother John took a Bible from the shelf, thinking that if he learned more about the Lord, he might understand why we live such a cold, miserable life. When he tried to open the book, it wouldn't open. It was just some prop, a sort of replica. Mama Charlene caught him, and that's when he spent 2 solid weeks in the shed. I genuinely cannot think of a single happy time from my childhood. We were encouraged to avoid human connection with each other. We were homeschooled. We had no toys, no TV. Music was forbidden in the house. Sister Sabrina was caught singing once, and all hell broke loose. The adults grilled her for hours on how she even knew what singing was, how she had learned to do that, etc., and she just said that she didn't know. It just felt like something that she could do with her voice. And as punishment, the adults made her eat a carrot. They told her that by ingesting the flesh of the devil, her voice would be forever cursed. It was miserable, just this daily drudge of bleak nothingness. Every day was exactly the same, and yet I rarely thought of escape. Other than the view beyond the high fence and the occasional glimpses of passers-by that we could see through the rare gap in the wood, we had no idea what life was even like on the outside of our little house in the middle of nowhere. And then I turned 18. On my 18th birthday, the adults woke me at just past midnight and ushered me down the stairs alone. In the kitchen, there was a cake, and it was unlike anything I'd seen before. Apparently, it was just for me. At first, I thought it was some kind of trick, but the smiles on their faces convinced me otherwise. I sat down and took a bite, and it was like heaven. Mama Charlene told me that what I was about to hear was going to be hard. Nothing I learned growing up was real. The world was a cold, harsh place, and she was a radical psychologist who had found a willing family to help her with her thesis. She believed that raising children without the concept of love and following a set of incomprehensible, inexplicable rules, and then introducing them to the concept of love and reality at 18 when they were old enough to understand it, would lead us to live the most fulfilling lives possible. She promised me that she taught me everything I needed to survive in the real world. She told me that all of them loved me really, and they loved all of us kids. And in her words, this was her thesis. Robbing us of our childhoods would enrich our adulthood beyond anything any normal person had experienced. I'm sure there was some kind of logic to this in her head. I'm sure that there was some kind of reason why 4 other adults had agreed to put their children through the coldest, most unloving hell to help her study her theory. Then came the kicker. Mama Charlene said it was totally my choice. They were not evil people, but I was now 18, and they wanted me to stay with the family and become one of the parents. I would now be known as Mother Krista, and I would mother a child of my own. I asked how that would work if Daddy Cobbleton would return, and she said yes, but that Daddy Cobbleton took the form of different men. I asked whether the Lord had blessed all of this, and I asked if she thought that she was doing the Lord's work, and they all sort of laughed at that. I think that's the part that hurt the most. The one being that I had loved, the one Savior I believed might one day save me from this hell. And they didn't even care about him. They didn't even believe in him. I kept my calm. I said I needed some fresh air, and I walked out the back door. I sat on the ride-on mower that we used to keep the lawn trimmed, and I crashed that mother effort through the fence and just kept on driving. It was the first time that I'd honestly seen the outside world. At that point, I flagged down a car, and they just took me to the nearest town, into a police station, and I just talked to them about everything. I expected my siblings to be saved, and my parents to be arrested. But do you know what happened? They got a warning and 6 months of regular visits from CPS. It was ruled that nothing that they had done actually constituted child abuse. Apparently, lying to your children about reality itself is not a crime worthy of having your kids taken away. One by one, my siblings turned of age, and they too left the cult that was Mama Charlene's family. We reconnected and started building our own lives. The first time we all got together and said I love you to each other, the tears did not stop flooding. And after I left, the family did start treating my siblings better. The presence of CPS kind of forced them into being a little more honest. By the time my youngest sibling, Roger, had left the family, he said it was almost tolerable. I've never spoken to any of the adults again, and I never want to. Maybe they weren't as bad as Ruby Frankie and her evil friend, but the psychological harm that they did to us with their made-up lunatic cult is something I still feel today. And from what I understand, the 5 of the adults still live together. Roger couldn't quite bring himself to cut them off, and he visits them and gives me updates from time to time. Apparently, Mama Charlene is suffering from a septic necrosis. One of the pills that she has to take for it, a sort of type of ibuprofen, is orange. And I wonder what the devil makes of that. Story 2. So, this is my dad's story, but he's giving me permission to share it with you after I got him to listen to a few episodes of the Let's Read podcast on a cross-country trip that we took recently. So, we hail from Tennessee. We've always been a Christian family. Mom and Dad raised me with a strong faith in God, and I've raised my kids the same way. Now, I won't turn this into a love-in, but my faith has given me strength in life more times than I can count. The scariest and weirdest thing that's ever happened to my dad revolved around a church and a preacher, though. Growing up, Dad's local church left a lot to be desired. He lived in a small backwater town with a small backwater church. And while the town folk were plenty of God-fearing people, they didn't hold the local preacher in quite such high regard as they held our Lord and Savior. Dad can't even remember the old fogey's name, so we'll just call him Pastor Bake. Yeah, I know. Now, Pastor Bake was a pretty old fella in fairness, but old beyond his years, too. That's 'cause he liked a bit of the sauce. You know what I mean? The local kids joked that he dipped into the communion wine, and Dad says that that was pretty much true. One time, allegedly, he was so drunk during a sermon that he briefly fell asleep at the pulpit before snapping awake. He was a harmless guy. He couldn't say otherwise, but he hardly inspired passion and confidence in people. Especially not in 1970, when the Vietnam War was still in full swing. People were losing loved ones, and the state of the world was terrifying, and people wanted faith more than ever. It was kind of difficult to go to church on a Sunday morning and listen to Pastor Begg slurring his way through his latest sermon about some dry topic that barely had any relevance to the modern America. It was no wonder that attendance dropped until they'd be lucky to have 20 parishioners in attendance on any given Sunday. And then the circus came to town. And I don't mean an actual circus, of course, although Dad does have some pretty cool tales to tell about a traveling circus that passed through one time. But no, the circus had a tent and a ringmaster, but there were no clowns or elephants in sight. It was one of those pop-up tent revival churches. It had a portable organ with a young and hip organ player, and it had a choir who would raise the proverbial roof, and most importantly, it had Pastor Trent. And if you've ever seen any movie or TV show that has a charismatic, larger-than-life pastor who throws himself around the stage, evangelizing the Word of God with enthusiastic abandon, then according to Dad, you've only seen half of what Pastor Trent had to offer. He was everything that Pastor Bake wasn't. Young, energetic, stylishly dressed, dripping with faith in the Lord, and most importantly, sober. The way Dad describes him, you'd almost picture Jesus himself. He had long hair that flew wildly as he gesticulated in his passionate sermons. He never claimed to be a faith healer, but he'd lay hands on the sick and elderly, and they would swear that they felt better. Dad says that Mr. Rockford, whose hands had been crippled by arthritis, was able to reopen his store for another 3 years after Pastor Trent shook hands with him. Now you might think Pastor Bake would have a problem with Trent setting up his tent revival in the nearby field. But even though attendance dropped to 4, including the organist, he seemed to appreciate the break, according to Grandpa's friend Steve, who still attended. Everyone else, though, was completely won over by Pastor Trent. And from the way Dad tells it, who could blame them? Now bear in mind, Dad was a 16-year-old boy at this time, and even the most well-behaved Christian teen has other things on their mind than going to church all the time. But at least the way he remembers it, Dad would actively get excited about going to the tent revival each week. And then one Sunday, something weird happened. Pastor Trent was doing his usual energetic routine, talking about how God loves us, how he's watching over the soldiers overseas and his soldiers in our country. And then Trent gets very quiet. Just full silence falls over the tent. Dad swears blind on his life that it felt like the heat in that place started creeping up and up and up. I mean, sure, it was summer, and they were in this big canvas tent, and it was standing room only, but it had never been that unbearably hot before. You could see people starting to sweat. Old Mrs. Crabjoy even wobbled against her son-in-law and looked like she might actually faint. Pastor Trent froze at the front. He gripped the sides of the platform and looked up and to the left. It was almost like he was listening to somebody that nobody else could hear. Dad says that you could have heard a pin drop. Nobody wanted to break the silence. Nobody even coughed. And then Pastor Trent clapped his hands together, making half the congregation jump. He started to say something, and then stopped like the words caught in his esophagus. He clears his throat and started again. "It's time for the church to move on," he said. And these murmurs ran through the crowd, and this pastor, Trent, waved his hands to settle everyone down and then announced that next week would be the final service before they moved on from the town. Of course, everyone was devastated, and nobody knew why. Trent and his choir ushered everyone from the tent, and they were barely speaking. And for the next week, the town was just awash with gossip. What had happened? Why had the pastor frozen midsman like that? Had he been listening to the voice of God? Now remember, this was 1970s, so there were no Bluetooth earpieces or anything like that. Everyone was poised for the final service next Sunday. Maybe there would be answers. In the meantime, Pastor Bake was on the decline. On the Wednesday, he was found stumbling around the town square at night, 3 sheets to the wind, rambling about how the devil was here to take us all away from him. And the sheriff had to lock the poor old guy up in some drunk tank and tried to get some sense out of him. And now, the sheriff was Grandpa's old pal. So Dad hearing this from Grandpa secondhand. Apparently the sheriff flat out asked Bake if he was talking about Pastor Trent. If Trent was the devil come to take us away. Pastor Bake said no. It wasn't Trent. Trent was a man of God. The townsfolk arrived at the tent that Sunday. At least most of them did. And the tent was still there. Pastor Trent was not, though. The whole place had been cleared out. The pews were all tossed around and knocked over. The pulpit had been smashed, but the electric organ was gone, and so was the generator. So were the trailers that the pastor and his crew had stayed in. They'd left early and clearly in a hurry. And then someone named Jerry Charlton came running up. Had anyone seen his wife? He asked. He thought that she'd left for church before him, but he couldn't see her in the crowd. She was pregnant with his kid, so where else could she be? And then a few other parishioners showed up. The school mistress, her husband, was missing. He was a meek, timid man who, everyone joked, had married a battle axe. And as the day went on, it came to pass that 12 people had disappeared, along with Pastor Trent in his choir. Most of them were people who had been in unhappy relationships. One of them was an 18-year-old girl who, rumor had it, was being abused by her stepdad. One of the two of them missing had no scandalous gossip surrounding them, but like Dad said, you just never know. It soon became the popular explanation that somehow all these people would run away with Pastor Trent in his church. And then talk extended to Pastor Trent himself. The Manson family had recently dominated the news, obviously, with their murder of Sharon Tate. Was Pastor Trent even really a pastor? Or was he some kind of cult leader like Charlie, who lured vulnerable people away with false pretenses? A lot of this gossip occurred in the most natural meeting place for the whole town church. Pastor Bake was back on his feet by this time, and it seemed like his time in the drunk tank had scared him a little straight. And when he overheard the talk about Pastor Trent, it was like the old fiery Pastor Bake of Y had returned. How dare people say this about a man like Pastor Trent? Trent was one of God's soldiers. The devil had been coming to our town and had his sights set on the missing 12. And like an angelic Pied Piper, Pastor Trent had led them to Heaven's Gate. Of course, this explanation did not sit well with pretty much anyone, and doesn't sit right with Dad to this day. I mean, that could mean anything, couldn't it? Were these people victims of abuse who Trent helped save? Is that what Pastor Bake believed in regards to the devil coming for them? And what did he mean by leading them to Heaven's Gate? There is an addendum to this weird and unusual tale, though. Everyone who disappeared was a grown adult, and there was no evidence of foul play. Given the volume of people who disappeared, and the testimonies that they all had troubled family lives, the cops weren't prepared to treat any of it as a missing persons case. But Jerry Charlton wouldn't leave it at that. And he scoured the damn country looking for Pastor Trent in his tent revival church. Every time he returned home, he had absolute murder in his eyes, vowing that whenever he found Trent, he would demand answers about his wife, and then send the man to the Lord himself. It took him almost 8 years, but he found them. None of the missing people were present at the tent revival. But not only that, Jerry Charlton refused to talk about what transpired when he finally met Pastor Trent again. All he would tell us is that Pastor Trent was a man of God, and that wherever our missing loved ones were, they were in a better place. Dad's theory is that Pastor Trent and his choir were running some kind of underground railroad for victims of domestic abuse. I've heard of traveling tent revival churches doing similar things, albeit many, many years later. I think I agree with Dad. Pastor Trent was helping people escape their bad situations, and maybe Pastor Bake even knew about it. And that's what he meant about the devil. Because maybe all those people who disappeared were at the end of their rope, so to speak. But even if that is true, even if Pastor Trent did lead these people to a better life, it still chills me to think about it, because Jerry Charlton had murder in his eyes every single time he set out in pursuit of that church. And then when he finally found Pastor Trent again, he returned a changed man. And we never speak about why. There's one thing Dad and I know for sure. Whatever happened between Jerry Charlton and Pastor Trent has sure as heck put the fear of God into him. Story 3. So, the absolute weirdest crap happened to my grandpa a few years ago. I got the call the next day, but this is what he tells me happened. And based on what I found, I don't think the old man's confused. He's a bit of a vulnerable old lad, but he's still in possession of his senses. Now it was late at night, and there was a knock at his door. Granddad lives alone ever since Nan died after she fell in front of a speeding lorry. Now, he was there, and it kind of messed him up. And ever since, Granddad, who was an agnostic for most of his life, has been looking to find faith. And that's why when these 2 young Mormon chicks arrived at his door, telling him that he'd arranged a meeting with them, he didn't really question it. He just figured his memory had slipped, and maybe it was normal for them to show up at 8 p.m. Now, this was before the movie Heretic had come out. And trust me, this isn't similar to that plot at all, I promise. Granddad didn't try and lock these chicks in his house or anything. Instead, he made them a nice cup of herbal tea, and they sat down and chatted for a while. One thing Granddad told me was that they didn't really seem particularly educated on Mormonism. The more they talked, and Granddad's always been a theologically curious man, even in his agnostic days, the more he got the impression that these girls either didn't really understand the church that they were a part of, or simply didn't care. Sure, they had the literature, pamphlets and things, but they weren't really able to describe anything that was in them. They simply suggested that they leave the reading material with Granddad, and he could make up his own mind. Now, I've dealt with Mormons before. One of my best friends, Chris, is a Mormon, and I know firsthand that Mormons can be very passionate about their church and their beliefs, especially the ones that go door to door, trying to convert people. Granddad knew this too. And despite his age, and the fact that he was slowing down, this started to ring alarm bells for him. The girls were called Emily and Bella, I guess. And Bella started asking Granddad about Nan and what had happened to her. And of course, being an old fellow who's prone to trips down memory lane, this led him to talk at length about his wonderful, beautiful wife, Evelyn, and the tragedy that took her from us. At the beginning of his story, Emily excused herself to use the bathroom. Granddad got into it, sharing tales of him and Nan talking Bella's ear off. And eventually the grandfather clock chimed at 9:30 p.m., and Granddad realized that Emily had been in the bathroom for almost half an hour. He paused his storytelling and asked Bella if her friend was okay. Bella waved it away and said it was normal. Emily usually spent a while in the bathroom and not to be concerned. Granddad wasn't having that, though, and I drummed into him over and over about scammers and weirdos, and he was already suspicious of these two ladies who were claiming that he'd booked an appointment with them. He argued that no, he would feel more comfortable if he went to check on Emily, and Bella clearly started to panic. Even though he was an old man with a cane, Granddad has a presence, especially a few years ago when he still lived by himself. Bella had no choice but to let him push past her and go find Emily. Emily wasn't in the bathroom. She was in his bedroom, sort of wandering around, looking at things, studying photos. Nothing inappropriate or anything he could accuse her of, but enough that Granddad really didn't want her poking around and asked the pair of them to please leave. Weirdly, they were almost too happy to go, and they left a bunch of pamphlets and literature for him to read when they'd gone. He went to sleep and had a pretty fitful night. He spent the night dreaming about hell, he says, and he kept waking up, convinced that someone was in the room with him, and the Lord will save you kept bouncing around in his head. The next day, he called me over and told me everything. I was baffled. We searched the bedroom, and it didn't seem like it had stolen anything, but I found a little black speaker stuck under one of the shelves. And then there was another by the headboard of his bed, and a third stuck inside a bedside drawer. They didn't seem to do anything, though, and they didn't appear to be listening devices. They were just speakers. Now next I looked at the literature they left behind. The girls had told Granddad that they were Mormons, but this literature certainly didn't belong to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Instead, it was a strange fringe offshoot of the Latter-day Saints, purely local, and based on a quick Google search, they were not held in very high regard at all by our local Mormon population. In fact, a handful of former members said that they were basically a cult that tried to convince other people to make the church sole beneficiaries of their wills. One common through line I found with the few people who talked about this extremely fringe church is that their frail elderly relatives had all talked about having dreams in which the Lord told them that the path of the church was righteous. Some even said angels were speaking to them. I had a theory. That night I stayed over at Granddad's. He slept in the spare room, and I stayed in his room working on my laptop until the early hours. Sure enough, at 1 a.m., the 3 hidden speakers crackled into life. They were simple pre-recorded messages telling the recipient that the end of the world was nigh, and they could secure their place in heaven by joining this fringe church and signing over their worldly goods to them. It's a pretty known scam, but I never heard of one that actually uses audio props and targets elderly folk in such a sinister way. Obviously, we called the authorities, and they took the speakers away and interviewed members of the church. No members of the church matched the description Granddad gave of Emily and Bella. So, our theory is that they hired actors and crooks to play these roles just so the church could deny all knowledge. Sadly, the investigation never went anywhere. And while Granddad avoided being a victim, I'm sure that there were other vulnerable old people who joined the cult, church, and spent the last days of their lives in poverty, waiting for a salvation that would simply never come. Story 4. So, I've been a listener for a couple of years, and it was my kids who got me into you. They know that I'm a big true crime and weirdness buff, and sent me one of your Appalachian videos. And from that day, I was hooked. My girls keep harassing me to send you a story of my own. And I was always thinking, well, I never got stalked along the Appalachian Trail, or kidnapped from a Walmart car parking lot, or flying kicked by a homeless bum. So what can I share? And then they said, well, Mom, weren't you in a literal freaking cult in school? And hey, I guess I was. Maybe it's not as glamorous as that makes it sound, but I did go through an absolutely crazy, terrifying, unusual incident when I was at boarding school. So, I wasn't the best kid. My parents didn't really know what to do with me. I got into buttload ads of trouble in middle school, and then the first year of high school was absolutely hellish. And looking back, I was incredibly grateful to my parents that they didn't just ship me off to some kind of military camp or allow me to end up in juvenile hall. Now, I don't want to go into the bullcrap that I got up to, but it wasn't anything you'd hate me for. I was just a little bratty who wanted to rebel against all the things teenage girls are supposed to be. So, being rebellious, I was. And the compromise was to send me off to boarding school for 1 year. And obviously, I hated it. I was expecting my peers to be a bunch of loser nerds who studied hard, played little, and made me look bad. Well, damn. I could not have been more wrong. On my first day at St. Jimmy's, not the real name, just a little Green Day reference for you, I soon realized that I was a very small fish in a pond full of piranhas. Now these kids, they knew how to be troublemakers, and I was honestly humbled. Any sensible kid would have kept their head down, or maybe begged their parents to come pick them up, crying that they'll be good. I promise. Just don't make me stay here with these lunatics. Me? No, I wanted to impress these guys. And when Laura, the absolute terror in my class, threw a chair and broke the window, I didn't want to avoid her. I wanted to be her friend. And when Brianna smuggled a towny boy into our dorm, and well, pretty much effed him, I didn't want to turn a blind eye to that. I wanted to help her cover it up. And when Chantel wanted to slash the tires of our math teacher's car for giving her a deserved bad grade, I wanted to make sure that she actually got away with it. I was desperate to please these girls, and desperate to be their friends. And they barely even noticed me. Only one of them did. My only real friend at the time, Noel. One day I confessed to her that the others were almost like a cult. I said that there was something about them that just commanded loyalty and admiration, and it reminded me of all the cult things that I'd read about. I've been kind of obsessed with it. In fact, Noel looked at me very funny and said, "You know why that is?" Yeah, and I didn't. So, I asked her, and that's when she told me. They were a cult, and they even worshipped a certain god, older than time, that she dared name even. And if I promised not to tell anyone about it, anyone at all, she'd get me into their next meeting. Now, I didn't believe in ancient gods and all that kind of stuff, of course, but I did believe in the power of human persuasion and hysteria. And even as a teen, I was fascinated by it. I was fascinated by the way people manipulate others and the concept of sociopathy and narcissism and peer pressure. I was also the biggest stand of The Craft, a movie that my parents swore was the reason that I'd gone all wayward. Now it wasn't, but I did still love it. So, how could I turn down the opportunity to join these girls and try to get an insight into what could be the very beginning of an honest-to-God cult? So, I nervously followed Noel out of our dorm in the middle of the night and avoided the night monitor. And then we snuck barefoot across the grass to the old caretaker's shed, which somehow Laura had the key for. I stepped inside to this sort of mix of incense, candle wax, and underneath all that, the obvious smell of weed. The other three girls were handing out a joint, giggling, and they were sitting around a book that sat open in the center of the shed, with 2 spaces for me and Noel. Now, long story short, the girls told me that they were acolytes of a demonic presence called Anti-God, and they called themselves the Sisters of Sleep. Now, if this sounds familiar to you already, bear with me because, yeah, the thing you're thinking of is exactly where they got it from. I hope it's not a spoiler at this point to reveal that it wasn't really an apocalypse cult, and we weren't really serving any type of anti-good. Noel and I sat around the circle, and they rambled on about the Sisters of Sleep and how we had to do what Anti-God commanded us to. The first task was that I had to cut my hand and drip my blood onto the sacred text that lay in front of us. They said the book took different forms of whoever looked at it, and the book that we saw before us would shape our future. Now for me, it was a copy of Jane Eyre. And now, to this day, I've never read Jane Eyre. And so, I actually cut my hand and bled onto what I'm sure was the school library book of this Jane Eyre. And then, Chantel made a big display of throwing her head back and rolling her eyes back into her head. The Anti-God was speaking through her and telling her the task that he had for us next. Noel leaned in and whispered that this was totally normal. Now, of course, I wasn't a complete, so I wasn't buying any of this. I knew it was some display the girls were putting on, some kind of play acting. But here's the important thing. They were including me. These cool, edgy, outcast, badass were bringing me into their inner circle. And let me tell you, acceptance and trust is more powerful than any demonic ritual or cursed copy of a Charlotte Bronte novel. The diabolical act that the Anti-God wanted the Sisters of Sleep to do next was to key the principal Dr. Lanahan's car. I wasn't at all surprised when speaking through Chantel. Anti-God decreed that I, the new girl, should be the one to do it. The others wanted to test my loyalty to their group, of course. And hell, I'd done worse things than key the principal's car in my time. What was the worst that could happen? I'd get kicked out of a school that I didn't want to attend anyway. But I didn't get kicked out. I keyed her car that night, accompanied by Noel, who kept watch. And she told me to write "The Sleeper Awakens" on the door. And I got as far as the sleep before we saw a flashlight beam in the distance and realized that we had to run before the security guard found us. And then the next night, back at the hut, speaking through Laura this time, it decreed that the sleep would be enough, as it showed my devotion to the cause. The next task we had to perform, in honor of our ancient god, was to graffiti the first-floor bathrooms, and this was our friend Brianna's job. This felt a lot less high stakes than what I'd been asked to do, but again, I was very aware that this was all play acting, and they were just testing me. Now Brianna was told to write, "Send me home, bitches," on the bathroom wall. And I thought nothing of this at the time. A bunch of other incidents happened after that. Vandalism, theft, pouring soap into the fountain, just a bunch of really essentially silly pranks. The most dangerous or risky ones always seemed to fall on me, though, as the new girl. And the last prank before everything went to crap was Chantel drawing a wiener on the English class blackboard. We had another meeting a few days later after that. Now, this time, Noel channeled Anti-God. Once again, it was me who was chosen to perform the duty. Now, according to Anti-God, I still had to make up for only writing part of the message on Dr. Lanahan's car way back. Now, I should note here that Lanahan had been absolutely fuming about the vandalism. Called a special assembly and everything, and if the culprit was found, there would be absolute hell to pay. Now, via Noel, Auntie God told me that I had to blow up one of the chemistry labs. Now hold on a second. I thought this was escalating pretty quickly, and besides, I had no idea how to blow up a chemistry lab. That's okay. Laura said Anti-God had pointed her to a book that would show me how to make an explosive using chemicals that I could find at the lab itself. How convenient. I really didn't want to do this. And this was obviously too far to go for an imaginary cult that I didn't even slightly believe in, but just wanted to fit in. But these girls were so persuasive. They talked about things Anti-God would do to me, but they were obviously talking about themselves. I don't even want to repeat them here, but these delinquents made it clear in no uncertain terms that if I didn't go along with their plan, they would do very bad things to me. The next day, Noel took me aside, and she confessed to me that, of course, Anti-God wasn't real, and the whole thing was just some setup. It was, in fact, some crap that they'd gotten from a movie called Prince of Darkness that they'd all watched last Halloween. I still never watched that movie either. It's still on the pile, along with Jane Eyre and one other thing that you'll find out later. Now, I told her I knew, but that I really wanted to be friends with these girls. Noel told me that's how it all started with her, too, and how she was essentially trapped. She felt if she didn't do what they said, they had blackmail material on her that would not only ruin her, but shame her parents, and possibly even land her in jail. Now, we talked for hours that night, and with Noel's guidance decided that the only real course of action was to set the explosion in the chem lab. So, I did. Obviously, it didn't blow up the whole room or anything. It just caused a fire in the chem lab that did a little bit of damage. Laura had done her homework, and I forget the details, but I was able to set up a chemical reaction that gave me enough time to get quite far away from the classroom before it went off. And with Noel and the other girls keeping watch for me, there was no chance of me getting found out. So that caused some chaos at the school for a few days. Everyone was focused on who'd blown up the chem lab, why anyone would do this, etc. So focused, in fact, that security was pretty lax when the other girls, without my knowledge, broke into the principal's office. They showed me their spoils at their next meeting. They'd stolen all of their permanent records, and this was their master plan. Cause chaos at the school, then steal our own files so any past indiscretions would be wiped from the history. This was the late 90s, so it was before most things were digitized. I guess now, nevertheless, I pointed out that this really didn't make any sense. People had memories. Chances are those records were just the principal's own copies, too. Now, I tried to be as nice as possible. I was trying to help. I didn't want to undermine their plan, but wow, these girls did not like being contradicted. Who was I to disagree with their master plan of the anti-God? Was I some kind of heretic? And this led to just some absolute fight where I told them that I knew that the anti-God was just some BS from a movie, and the whole thing was just some big joke. Now, they didn't deny this. In fact, they just laughed at me. They told me I was the one who didn't understand. Of course, there was no anti-good, no blood rituals, nothing like that. They knew Noel had told me everything because they had known all along that I never believed it. And that was why it was so funny to them, because I still did all those things. They held so much power over me that they'd managed to create a cult through literal willpower and peer pressure alone. And then Noel stepped forward. She held some book out that she'd gotten out of the library, Cults in Our Midst, by Margaret Singer. And this is the third thing on the pile of things that I've never engaged with. But with this one, it's simply because the idea of reading about it would just be too scary even now. Noel then goes into a speech about how she'd read the book, and how she and Laura had to make a bet that people weren't that easily influenced, and couldn't be so easily bullied into self-destructive behavior that went against their best interests just to fit into a cult-like group. Noel had been the one to insist they could. This whole cruel experiment had been Noel's. The one person that I thought was actually my friend. The one person at that damn school that I trusted. The whole time I was just her plaything, to prove that some human beings are weak and mindless enough to be influenced into cult-like behavior for literally nothing other than boredom. And I was chilled to my core. What was their end goal? They'd pointlessly stolen their own permanent records for what reason? And I found out the next day, the principal and some members of staff were waiting for me. They were holding a bunch of folders, all of which they'd found tucked under my mattress after some anonymous tip. There was also a note in my handwriting addressing my friends, saying something about how I'd stolen their permanent records for them and hoped that they'd be grateful. Their idiotic plan wasn't so idiotic after all. I guess they'd framed me, and now I was getting kicked out of school, all because these weirdos wanted to prove that they could convince the new girl that cults were real. And, I guess, when I didn't fall for the anti-God crap, they just modified their approach and decided that bullying and peer pressure was close enough to cult-like behavior. And when you think about it, I guess it kind of is. I got kicked out of that school and began the most depressing, bleak period of my life. My parents didn't believe me, of course. They just saw me as the ungrateful brat who'd thrown away my one chance. Thankfully, I was able to enroll in one of the local high schools I hadn't been expelled from. And there, I actually worked my ass off, graduated, and then went to college and eventually did my master's. And no, it didn't have anything to do with cults or criminal psychology. I never want to see another damn wannabe edgy cultist for as long as I live. Story 5. Now I need to be careful with what I say here because I don't want to bring hell itself down on me again. This was one of the most terrifying things I've ever gone through, and I don't want to risk even the slightest chance of the same people getting mad. 'Cause let me tell you, these people are horrifying. They're worse than anything you'll find on the dark web. And I would rather walk down a pitch-black street in the middle of Birmingham naked, painted in day-low paint, than have to face these horrors again. Now, let me explain. I used to post a lot on Twitter, like terminally online a lot. I was one of those annoying bints who have an opinion on everything. Main character of the day. Best believe that I was there giving my 2 pence. Remember that bean dad guy who wouldn't give his lass a can opener or whatever? I barely remember it, but I do remember that I wrote a 7-tweet thread about the guy. What else was there? Oh, the black and gold or white and blue. That dress Yanny or Laurel. I used to tweet at bloody Stephen Fry and Neil Gaiman like we were pals. Yeah, that second one aged right. Well, now one thing I really loved was the trending topics and hashtags. It was almost like a delicious menu of completely meaningless crap that I just have to have an opinion on, whether I actually had an opinion on it or not. I mean, why the hell did I get into a 2-day-long row with people about the YouTuber Ninja? I still told him to go suck a Dennis Thanks autocorrect and managed to get into a row with Ninja Stance. The best part is, I thought the hashtag was about the guy from Dawnfort. And I don't give a crap about Fortnite, but I sure as hell know a lot about Tyler Ninja after his fans told me numerous ways in which I deserved to get touched. All of this pales in comparison to the really terrifying event I got myself into, though, and it was for equally stupid reasons. I can't even explain who I'm talking about exactly, but I'll just say this. The hashtag I saw was a color combination. A color combination I don't like. And it also happens to be a band, a pop band of the K variety. Now the irony is, after this whole incident, I actually listened to them and do love them. I also really love that song by Rose about meeting her at the Apetapete. Hopefully, this is now clear enough without me quite saying any keywords that'll get me flagged up on Reddit, or, if I'm especially lucky, if you include this in a video. So anyways, what I saw was the hashtag of the band name, and I thought that it meant the color combination. So I posted "Not all your band name effing sucks." Then I logged off, thought nothing of it, and went and had dinner with my boyfriend. When I next checked my phone and saw 99+ notifications from Twitter, I had a sinking feeling. Could people really be that mad that I didn't like the color combination? So before even unlocking my phone, I said to my boyfriend, "Holy crap, I tweeted that I don't like black and pink together, and I think people are really mad at me." He looked at me like I just told him that I'd run over a dog. And that's when I knew that I had absolutely effed up and was about to find out. He asked me if I was sure that's what I said, or if I said that I didn't like a very similar-sounding band. I said that I didn't really know. And that's when he explained to me what K-pop stands are. Considering what a terminally online dumbass I am, how this escaped me baffles me to this day. We looked at my phone together, and it may have shown 99+ notifications on my display screen, but in reality, it was well over 1,000 tweets. I can't even repeat some of the things that they told me should happen to me. I was told that I should be peeled apart from various orifices. One person wrote a 10-tweet fanfiction about me choking on centipedes, which they dug up from my profile and found out that I actually had a phobia of. Of course, this also involved a bunch of people sending me photos of said insects, the British and American kind. And you ever seen the first Terrifier movie? One Twitter user sent me a gift of the girl being sawed in half by Art the Clown up the middle. If you've seen it, you know what I mean. And they sent this to me 14 times. Thankfully, my DMs weren't set to public, but that didn't stop a few people I did follow from sending me abuse as well. No friends, of course, but just some folks that I had pleasant interactions with in the past. And the abuse did not stop. In the end, as much as it pained me to do so, I deleted my Twitter altogether. Over 10,000 banger posts completely gone. But of course, then they'd found my Instagram, my Facebook, my poor old mom's Facebook, my LinkedIn. They found the coffee shop where I worked. And that's where a big revelation came from. Actually, I got called into work, and my boss, who was thankfully a good friend of mine, told me to listen to this. Our answering machine was full. And the things these people were saying were vile, terrifying, and threatening. Or they would have been if not for the fact that about 80% of the callers were clearly under the age of 14. Yeah, I was being harassed and tormented by literal tween. Some of them were older, sure, and there was some very camp-sounding Irish guy who went into detail about eating my toes. I asked my boss what she wanted to do. I offered to quit, and she said, "No freaking way." Mostly because it wouldn't help. These people were nutso children, and they were going to keep calling whether I actually worked there or not. Instead, she and my boyfriend Frog marched me to the local cop shop, and we told them everything. Turns out there's not a lot that the cops can do when you're being harassed by feral kids. The sheer volume of weirdos harassing me had to mean that it was being organized from somewhere, but trying to pinpoint where was absolutely impossible. Where do K-pop kiddies even go to hang out? Tumblr? I have no idea. And neither did the cops, and there was nothing they could do or would do. Then it died down. The cult of K-pop kiddies decided to leave me alone. What a relief. Scary story over. Let that be a lesson to you. Don't insult a band. At least I came out of it unscathed. Just kidding. If you've ever run afoul of bored tween stan culture, you know they don't stop at normal things like death threats and harassment. And just when I thought it was safe to go back to normal, I went downstairs one morning to see something strange sticking through my letterbox. I got closer, wondering what the hell it was. Someone had shoved a dead pigeon halfway through my letterbox. It had gotten stuck, but not before, well, the viscera had squished out of its beak. And judging from the state of decomposition, I'm pretty sure that the pigeon had been dead for a while. So, at least I don't have its death on my conscience. I tried to convince myself that it was just some coincidence. Some other random lunatic had shoved a dead pigeon through my door. But no, of course not. When I extricated the cadaver from its resting place, I found a black and pink ribbon tied around its neck. There was no question, and surely this wasn't some little kid. Of course, we told the cops, who dusted for fingerprints and all that kind of stuff. I don't know if they actually dusted the letterbox or the dead pigeon or what, but unsurprisingly, they found nothing. And that same day, my boyfriend got a Ring doorbell, and I guess that scared them off because nothing else happened at our home. Unfortunately, this wasn't the end, though. One day I was on the other side of town, picking up some supplies from the coffee shop that I worked at as an assistant manager. I'd parked down a side street and gone in to see our supplier, who hooked us up with a particular brand of imported coffee that no one else in town had. And as such, we had a kind of friendly relationship. So, I hung out with the guys for half an hour, telling them about the weird crap that I've been experiencing. When I emerged from the back of their warehouse, in this absolutely nowhere side street that nobody ever went down, my car had been spray-painted. Now, I'm sure you can guess the two colors that adorned my little Honda Accord. "The cult remembers," is what it said on the windscreen. I called the cops again, and holy heck, not only was there a security camera in the alley, but it was working too. This time the K-pop cult member wasn't some tween girl, but was in fact an adult man. I never saw him myself, and the cops handled it all because there was no need for me to be involved. He made no attempt to hide his face, probably because he had no idea that there was a security camera watching him. And I can only imagine how the officers reacted watching a grown man, who I'm told was in his early 40s, leaping around my car and spray painting pink and black graffiti all over it. Was he dressed in band merch? I wish I knew. It made me think, if lunatic fans like this can behave this terrifyingly towards me, what must it be like for the artists themselves? Imagine being Taylor Swift, for example, knowing that a muscly, bearded guy is out there threatening to kill people if they do you wrong. What would it take for his eye to be directed at his idol? Now, I wish the story had stopped there, but there was one more twist in this tale. A few months had passed, and it seemed like everything had died down. Life had gone back to normal. We were out at a bar together, and I went off to use the ladies' room. When I came back, a strange woman had sat next to my boyfriend at the bar. I watched from a distance, and I'm ashamed to say it, but I'm a little bit of a jealous person. And in fairness, in the past, he's given me a reason to be jealous. So, without thinking anything more of it than my boyfriend being hit on by a random woman, I just watched. She was all over him, touching his arm, laughing at his jokes, leaning in to whisper in his ear. And he was eating it up like the chump he was. I watched, looking around the corner of the corridor leading to the LS, as this woman reached down and began fondling my boyfriend. He didn't resist. He let her take a sip of his drink even. And then she leaned in and licked his freaking ear. I just crept closer, and that's when I heard her say the thing. She said, "How you like that?" And it didn't hit me at first, despite being a victim of stans. I didn't really pay attention to their music. But then the woman kissing my boyfriend on the side of the mouth reached into her purse and pulled out a little card. A two-tone card. You guessed it, black and pink. She tossed it down in front of him and walked away, but not before tipping me a little wink. So, the cult of the band stans had finally gotten their ultimate revenge. One of their nutjob fans had seduced my boyfriend right in front of me, and the sweetie little had been enough of a horny freak to fall for it. The message was very clear and succinct. You play with fire, you're going to get burned. But consider this. This cult ranged from middle-aged men to attractive 20-something women to angry tween, all of whom wanted to actively ruin my life because they thought I'd been insulting their favorite band. And if you remember, I wasn't even talking about the damn band. I was talking about the color combination. People be cray-cray. Let's read. I swear to God, I don't use social media anymore because you hear about terrifying cults like the Antill Gang or Jonestown. But the cult of celebrity, the Taylor Swift stans, or the K-pop girlies, or hell, I don't know, maybe even Bowling for Soup diehards, they're all lunatics. People can find anything to worship, and people can find anything to use as an excuse to go absolutely frothing crazy. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m., and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at Let's Read. What the am I doing? And there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. It's kicking butt, and I think you should check it out. All links in the description below. Thanks much, friends. And remember, the earth isn't flat. It jiggles.